Welcome to the podcast, guys. This is Diary of a Muslim Entrepreneur, and this is episode 1 with Musheer Ahmed, the founder of CODOXO. Now, I hope that if you guys find this podcast valuable, if you have any questions that I should ask Brother Musheer the next time we get into a conference room and get at it for the pod, please leave your comments and questions down below. I'd be happy to answer or ask those questions of him the next time.
Let's get started. Assalamu alaikum, Brother Musheer. It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person. I just want to say welcome to the pod, and let's dive into it. Let's learn a little bit more about CODOXO. So tell us a little bit more about yourself first, and then let's dive into how it even began, and then I guess we'll go from there.
Perfect. Sounds good. And it's my pleasure to meet with you, Daniel. I heard great
Absolutely.
things about you, so happy to be on this podcast. So as a quick background on myself, I went to Georgia Tech. I did my undergraduate degree, and while I was completing the degree, got a lot of interest in the cybersecurity space and decided to apply to the PhD program in cybersecurity and began that. When I started my PhD at Georgia Tech, I was looking for what areas I'd like to do research on, and that's the time when the government started adopting the use of electronic medical records. Back then, over a decade ago, you may recall that everyone was still doing paper charts at hospitals.
So would this be like telehealth, those kind of, like the government started funding stuff like that? Or like something like ZocDoc?
No, it's more like back then if you went to a doctor, they would have a physical chart, like they would write things in a file and take medical notes. It's over a decade now since that has changed. And the government said that a patient who's over 65 years old typically has 5 or more chronic conditions.
Wow.
They go to 5 different specialists. They repeat the same test over and over again. And the government and insurance companies were bearing the cost of those. So the government said, why don't we create everything electronic, move all the records into an electronic format that would allow for medical data to be exchanged and shared across providers and would reduce the cost in the healthcare system. That was the goal with which they moved in that direction.
Wow. And so what problem does CODOXO solve in that sphere of problems, I guess you could say?
No,
Because you're going from paper to essentially digital, but CODOXO, from my understanding, solves a couple of those problems and is also trying to solve future problems too. Well, maybe you can go into more details as to what CODOXO does.
Absolutely. So the journey was that I envisioned certain challenges that the healthcare infrastructure would actually go through once its data goes electronic. And my entire dissertation was addressing these problems on how to secure electronic healthcare data because I predicted that cyber criminals would come in and attack this data more than any other kinds of data, and that prediction did come through. If you go into the black market today for healthcare data is way more valuable, sometimes 10 times more valuable than financial data and banking data. And that has made healthcare industry highly targeted industry by cyber criminals. And the next part was, how do you securely share this data? For that work, I did get invited by the federal government to some meetings in DC to talk about the research I had done. And the final part of my thesis was, how do you prevent bad actors from monetizing on stolen healthcare data? And one of the things they engaged in was fraud, waste, abuse. And so a lot of people, when people think about fraud, the first thing that comes to mind is financial fraud, credit card fraud, identity theft. But if you look at credit card fraud numbers, in America, you lose about $10 billion annually. But financial healthcare fraud, you lose hundreds of billions of dollars annually.
So I guess the question here is, when you say healthcare fraud, is it, let's say, somebody who's taking that information, then submitting that to maybe an insurance provider and then getting a payout from that? Is that maybe a possible form of fraud? What are the different forms of fraud that you would see in that sector?
A great question. So that is a one way in which fraud can be committed. So initially we were looking at phantom clinics was a major fraud scheme, and the way those would work was somebody would create a clinic using a fake PO box address which looked like a real street address, and would use stolen patient IDs and provider IDs and file claims for $10 to $20 million with health plans. So the patient never met the provider, the clinic doesn't exist, it's just on paper.
And then the check would then go to that address,
Yes.
and therefore they would get the funds, and then they would deploy.
And they would move to another state, repeat the whole process, and people made a lot of money. we started off with that, but fraud in general can be committed by multiple parties. You have patients that can commit fraud, who steal identities from other patients and use that or do other things, get involved in other patient-centric schemes. Then you have providers that can engage. So providers, what I mean by that is doctors, facilities. And there is a spectrum of issues. Majority of providers, again, are good providers. I would say probably 70 to 85% of all doctors out there and healthcare institutions are good, and they want to do the right thing. But there's about 15% of them that are kind of pushing the boundaries and trying to commit fraud.
So that means that, I guess just to put it in context, that means for every $100 million in revenue, we would say $15 million is potentially like fraud?
So no, 3 to 10% is in terms of revenue.
Got it.
So the spend, so the estimates, the public estimates that are out there is 3 to 10% of healthcare spending is lost to fraud, waste, and abuse through that entire spectrum. So fraud is defined as something that's done intentionally. So if somebody's intentionally trying to make money or steal money, that's fraud. But if you are doing things that may not have the intention, then we can classify them as waste, abuse, error in that spectrum. So 3 to 10% is the figure. So we know that healthcare spending last year crossed about $4 trillion. I believe it was $4.3 trillion. So up to $430 billion every year in the US is lost to fraud, waste, abuse.
There's so much money that could be put back into the system more efficiently to be used for so many other things, but then instead it's going into a direction which doesn't benefit society at large, which is very interesting. I guess that's essentially the problem that CODOXO is solving, right?
Yes. So this cost of fraud actually is borne by the patients because your premiums go up every year, and one of the factors that drives your premiums is the cost of fraud. And we, in general, there have been some studies out there that say that you're paying thousands and sometimes up to tens of thousands of dollars more because fraud is factored into the cost of providing those services. So our goal at CODOXO is to make the healthcare system more affordable and effective. And our way of doing that is to weed out the fraud, waste, abuse in the system that exists today.
Got it. So the existing system as it sits right now, we already know there's so many inefficiencies, right? Where if one person, or let's say a doctor puts down this person had, was in a car accident 6 months ago and they have more spinal related issues, it could be thrown out by the insurance. And then unless it was coded correctly, right? So coding becomes a little bit of an issue. And then in terms of getting the insurance payout to help out that individual, because the ultimate goal is to help out an individual, right? I guess my question here is, let's see, what was my question? My train of thought just went out the door. Okay, if I come back to it, it'll come back to me. But prior to us even starting the conversation, you mentioned that CODOXO, when it was being founded, I guess, when was CODOXO founded? It was founded at Georgia Tech, but I don't remember the exact date when it was started.
So we formally launched as a company in 2017. So I had completed my PhD, and Georgia Tech, I won a couple of awards at Georgia Tech for the work that I had done. And when I was wrapping up, so I got, so there is a foundation, national foundation called the Wallace Coulter Foundation. So Wallace Coulter is the guy who got the patent on blood cell counts. So any blood test anyone does in the world uses his technology to count them. So he created a national foundation and said anybody that does innovative research to impact healthcare, that he will give a grant to fund it. So we were selected by this national organization, got a couple of $100,000 of money from them, saying that what the research I had done was so impactful that they wanted to see this in the commercial world. And then I also got selected by the state of Georgia, had some funds as well available for innovative research to help commercialize and make an economic impact. So I got a little bit of money from the state of Georgia, a little bit of money from this national foundation, and we did something called translational research. So basically, not the research, actual academic work was done, but I started the process of commercializing the research and building a product around it. So we did that transitional period for almost a year. And then I was approached, and during this process, I took part in a couple of startup competitions. One of the big ones, back when I launched in 2017, there was one called Atlanta Startup Battle, and we had about 400 startups from the Southeast compete. And I participated in that as well and ended up winning that competition. It was judged by investors from Silicon Valley, flew in from California to judge it. And as soon as I got off the stage, I still remember, like, they came up to me and they said, okay, we're going to have breakfast tomorrow. I want to talk to you. And so they told me, all right, we want to fund this this startup. And
so walk me through what that breakfast conversation was like, because that's not something that many founders, or at least people in the Muslim community, don't ever deal with or ever get a chance to do, right? With Silicon Valley investors or investors in general. What did that conversation entail? Like, how did they even, other than approaching you after the presentation itself, what was that conversation? Did it last for maybe a week, 2 weeks, and then they invested? Or was it like, Musheer, I want to go ahead and put my money, I don't care how much it costs, I'm in, and put me in seed round number 1? Well, like, give us a little bit of a flavor of that meeting.
No, that's a great question, and I want to start off by, alhamdulillah, like, Allah has supported and granted all the success that I have. And so I met him at breakfast, and basically he told me that he sees the signs of a very large company with the ideas that I'm presenting and the work that I've done. And he wanted to be the first investor in the company, which is a seed round investor, and he wanted to lead the round. So usually when you do venture capital funding, you have, the first round is called a seed round. Some people do an angel round. I didn't have to do that. They do the seed round, and then you have series A, B, C, and onwards. And every round has a lead investor. So the lead investor decides what is the price and value of this company.
They gave you like a term sheet, I'm guessing,
Yes.
right?
Yes,
With
exactly.
which detailed exactly how much they want to buy of the company, etc. And maybe you can give a bit more insight into that.
Yes, no, that's exactly correct. So what they provide you is something called a term sheet, and the term sheet puts a value into the company at the stage at which you're at, and basically puts a price on the share, and they request to buy a certain number of shares of your company through that. So he told me he would like to put out a term sheet, and he would like to give me some money back then. And he wanted to give me a good sizable amount of money, which was over $1 million back then to start, alhamdulillah, the company. So I did not immediately accept the offer. I told him, Liz, thank you for the offer, and I definitely am interested, and kept the channel of communication open with him. I told him I wasn't ready to launch the company at that point. I was going through the translational research phase, and when I was ready to launch the company, I did reach out to him and say, okay, now I'm ready to start a company. So he submitted a term sheet, and I actually was fortunate enough to get other term sheets as well. And we had a lot of investor interest, and I was fortunate, alhamdulillah, to pick and choose whose money I wanted to take, and I was able to launch a seed round.
This leads me into another question, is to how do you determine who's a good investor for your company? Because there are multiple types of investors, right? You have some that want to be actively involved in the business. You have some that are just like, just take my money, you do what you need to do with it, I hope to get a 10x return. So where do you draw the line, and how do you decide for yourself what's the best investor to have, especially if you're starting up a company?
No, that's a great question. I think the number one criteria that any entrepreneur should look into is the person itself, the investor. I think because when you take money from someone, you begin a long-term journey, and you are going to have a lot of interaction with this person. So choosing the right person you want to work with, I believe, is the number one criteria that everyone should have. Someone may give you better term sheets, but I think the people you work with is more important than the numbers that they give you. So I did my own background check. I mean, I called people who've taken money from him before, asked him. You can always ask investors for references. They will give other entrepreneurs that they've worked with, and you can have a candid conversation with them. on what was their experience working with that person. So alhamdulillah, he was. I had some good information about him. People who had worked with him, I spoke with them and decided to move forward with them. So I would say that is number one criteria. Number two is always take money from people who I would say have done this a lot in the past, and they have a lot of experience investing. You don't want to take money from someone who just started off, because then when things are going great, everyone is excited. When things are going bad, you want someone who's been through that before and understands that every company goes through ups and downs. And taking money from institutional investors is always better than individuals, just because institutional investors, they understand companies better, and they are more resilient to any future changes.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. So I tell him, I guess, when you were establishing CODOXO, did you have a co-founder or a partner with you? Because obviously, if you're building a multi-million-dollar company at some point, you need partners to build the organization. So maybe tell me a little bit more about that in terms of partnerships you've done in order to grow the business.
You're absolutely spot on, right? Entrepreneurs, I think the journey itself is a lonely journey, and having people along that journey is incredibly important. Unfortunately, I was the only full-time founder at the company. I did have my academic advisor lean in with advice. So he would spend maybe 2 hours a week with me, or 2 to 4 hours a week giving me advice. He had done it in the past. He had other students who had created companies, and they're very successful companies. So he had a lot of advice that he gave me on. So I count him as my co-founder.
Okay.
So, but he wasn't full-time dedicated. He was still a professor at Georgia Tech and was working there full-time. So I ended up being the only full-time founder of the company, and had a lot to learn. So what I did was I took the help of a lot of mentors, other people who've gone through this journey before, started having regular meetings with them, getting their advice, feedback, talking to other people. I think there's a large network of people that help support me in various stages of the process to give me all the knowledge I needed to take the company this far.
Well, if you were just the initial founder, how did you start building out the team? And I guess, like, where did you start? Because that's a question probably a bunch of other founders also have too, right? I'm starting a business, but I don't know who do I have for finance? Who do I have for actual product development? Who do I have for, I don't know, maybe IT subsystems or whatever else it may be? How did you start building out your team over a period of time, since you've been established in business since 2017? I'm imagining that has grown since then. I guess maybe you can give us an idea of your growth from 2017 in terms of employees, of course, not revenue. But yeah, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. So of course, when you start off, the founder does everything.
Yeah.
You have to learn really fast, and you have to do everything at the start, and then you start hiring people to fill that gap. So I would say the first year we were probably like 7-8 employees, up until maybe we added a few handful every year. We ended 2019 with probably about 12 employees, and 2020 we ended maybe with 25. Then 2021 we ended with like 35, and today we're about 60 plus.
Wow, so the growth has been quite a bit. I guess a question that comes into my mind is, I see that the growth non-COVID years is rather slow, but when COVID hit, the number just spikes. Why is that the case?
So I think we hit an inflection point in the business. So we did our seed round initially, then we did our Series A round in 2020, actually right at the after COVID had started. And at the Series A round, what investors typically look for is a business that's established, that has a handful of clients, that's doing a good amount of revenue, that's able to show repeatability. And the Series A investors come in and say, okay, how do we start scaling this into a bigger organization? So we did our Series A round in 2020, mid of 2020, and that's when we started hiring more people, scaling and expanding our operations at that time.
This leads me into a question. So when you had that meeting with the investor, and I'm guessing this was in 2017, right?
Yes.
How long was it before you decided to take his check? Was it 2020? 3 years
Oh,
later?
no. So 2017, we
Okay.
took the seed round
Okay,
check.
got it.
So my breakfast with him was probably end of 2016.
Okay.
And so it was a few months between that breakfast and when I actually took the term sheet and accepted it from him and executed it. So he was the seed round investor. Then we got
Got it. Okay, so
other
then you had your
investors.
Series A and C. Okay,
Yeah.
so on. Got it. Okay, that makes sense. So let me ask you another question. One that piques my interest a little bit is normally your first hire is probably one of the most important hires you make within a business because they influence you and the growth of the business in many different facets. Who was your first hire and how did they impact the business to help it grow?
Great question. So we wanted to build out a product. The core research that I had done was to build out AI technology, but there was no product around it that was usable by folks. So the first hire I wanted to make was somebody who had experience building a product before and managing a small team of people to do that end to end. So my first hire was a director of engineering, and I took advantage of my network, reached out to people, asked if they knew anyone that's done this, built out a product from scratch using a small team before, got introduced to someone that I interviewed, and he was good, and we brought him on board, and then hired a few developers under him, and grew out the team. So my first one was this technical person who
Got
could
it.
handle the day-to-day.
So was he more of a CTO, I guess, for the organization?
You could call him that. And back then, titles
Yeah,
in a small company
course.
didn't mean much. But yeah, so he had handled developing the first team out, a handful of developers that we hired.
Got it. So then, one question that also comes into my mind, you mentioned that the CEO basically does everything in the business. That's in practically every single startup. The CEO does anything and everything, whether it's taking care of the books, whether it's establishing or creating a product or engineering a product. In some cases, the team. So that was your first essential hire, essentially, to build out the business. You also, based on what I've heard from you, is that you also built out the core product in the very beginning, from the very, very beginning. That means back into the Georgia Tech days,
Yeah.
basically. So then, if I were to take a look at your product back in 2017 versus what it is today, what would you say are the key differences, or what are some of the key learnings that you've had since you've had this business up and running over the past 5 to 6 years?
Oh, that's. I think the product has completely changed. So it's. I don't think anything is similar to what it was back then because we are constantly trying to learn, understand market signals, and expand the product and evolve the product to make sure it meets the needs of all our clients. So I was managing the product side of things. We had someone doing the engineering side, but just I believe about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, we hired a VP of product, and now he's managing the product side of things. But the product evolved. I think once you start getting your first client, you learn so much. Because until we got our first client, we had made certain assumptions. Those assumptions, of course, get broken. Some of them get reinforced, and then you evolve the product to make sure that you're continuing to meet the needs of people. If you want more concrete examples, I'm happy to.
Yeah, of
share
course.
them as
Well,
well.
share one. I'd love to hear it. Maybe this could benefit the Muslim at large too, right? If somebody's in a similar position, I mean, why not? So I would say, please do. I'd love to hear it.
Sure. So my examples are very particular, specific to my journey, but I'm sure people will have some interesting surprises. So the core technology I developed was AI-based technology that we ended up building the product around. When we started working with our first client, they're like, yeah, AI is fantastic. It's amazing. We're finding millions of dollars. Like the first client, when we went live, in the first week, they saved $1 million.
Wow.
And he called me and he told me, like, this ROI is phenomenal. Like, I love the product. But then we got some feedback saying, so we were a transition from rule-based systems. So rule-based systems always get evaded by criminals, and they find ways to circumvent those protections. So we were running a pure AI play.
So when you say rule-based, explain that to the audience.
Okay, great question. So rule-based are basically static things, which basically say if X happens, X, Y, and Z happen together, then this is an indication of fraud. and I'm going to stop this payment from happening because this matches fraud. Now, what criminals get smart about is would they eventually figure out what those parameters are and change it slightly, which will circumvent. Now it's not X, Y, Z, it's X plus 1, Y, Z, and now you're passing that through and you've evaded that protection mechanism. The AI systems are smarter. There are different kinds of AI systems, but the one we designed was smarter we called it self-learning, was able to identify what changes are happening and pinpoint any new fraud schemes that were emerging. The surprise I had in my learning was people said, AI is, the ROI is phenomenal, but we'd also like the comfort of having some rules in there. So we ended up adding rules in there as well, just to capture some of the low-hanging fruit that they wanted, just because they wanted us to hit a checkbox saying, okay, we also do this rule-based stuff in addition to the AI work that we were doing. So now in our product, we do have, of course, AI is our core differentiator, but we do have a bunch of rules that people have used in the industry historically to continue to evaluate claims on those metrics.
Got it. So I'm just curious, how many clients did you start with in the very beginning, and then what would you say your total client count is today, if you're willing to disclose that? If you're not,
absolutely. So of course we started at 0. So I was the salesperson, the only salesperson in the company. So I would travel around the U.S. So our clients are all across the U.S. I would travel all over the U.S., meet with people, and show them the product and sell it to them. And we ended up getting our first couple of clients. So the way we measure our growth is the number of covered lives, which is how many people's claims data is being processed through CODOXO today. So today, alhamdulillah, we process claims for 40 million people in the US. So our clients are pretty large health insurance companies. So they are insuring 40 million people, and we get all their data, we process all their data, and we secure all their claims.
40 million is roughly what, about a little bit more than 10% of the total population of the United States.
Yeah.
That's huge. That's really huge with the size of team you currently have. I mean, like, count per employee is probably well above $1 million per employee. A little less than that, but still, it's still phenomenal. That's amazing. That's genuinely amazing. So what's the future plan for growth for CODOXO? How can people learn more about CODOXO itself? And I guess, where do you see the company in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years?
So I think we are still scratching the surface on the impact we can have. We actually just recently launched some new products for our clients, which have been very well received by the market. So we're expanding our range of offerings to these health plans and going after them. We started off by focusing on private health insurance companies, which is, you can think about Blue Cross Blue Shields. We have a lot of states that work with us. And then of course non-blues and other commercial private health plans. But now also have government agencies like state Medicaid agencies. We also are working towards federal contracts now. So that's an exciting space for us. So there's a lot of areas for us we've started expanding into. So I think the opportunities for us are really endless. And our product not only does detection, but today we manage the end-to-end entire workflow process for fraud, waste, abuse, and payment integrity. Not only do we detect, but we allow people to drive automation into their organizations and automate a lot of manual tasks to reduce investigative and analysis time from sometimes days and weeks to a matter of hours with that, and are able to digitize everything. There's a lot of paper things, Excel files being used. We're able to get rid of all of that and automate everything into a very nicely packaged product today. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to grow in, and we have a long-term roadmap that we're really excited to execute on.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. So is there a plan to even go into, let's say, Europe or Asia and other markets that could potentially use this? Because I wouldn't imagine. Although the U.S. healthcare system is quite complex, I'm assuming that if you were to take this into, let's say, Latin America or even Europe or Asia, that you could potentially even have more success.
You're absolutely right. Actually, we've been contacted by insurance companies across the world for something like what we do. So I've had insurance companies reach out from Turkey, from Saudi, from some other North African countries. So we've had some inbound India as well. Some interest come in from these international places, but we're just not at a point where we can support international clients. But I think at the right time we would be open to supporting them and expanding to those regions.
Wow, that's amazing. That's really amazing. Like, genuinely amazing to me, at least. So I guess one of the questions that came up in my mind is, now that you're sitting at 60 employees, you're hitting almost 40 million people, outside of all the other additional services and products that you may be offering, is there ever a future where CODOXO maybe becomes part of the insurance companies, or maybe is it always going to be a standalone thing where the data is always protected in its own little lane, you could say?
So what do you mean by become a part of
would you be ever open to potentially having an insurance company ever buy you guys out completely? And because then the issue, the question that comes into my mind is the consumer data protections, right? Because not all of the consumers want their data to be open out there. How do you? I guess you also have to comply with GDPR rules and all these other things that come along with health-related data, as well as foreign data, so to speak. So it's just a thought that was in my mind. Don't worry about the question.
So this is a heavily regulated industry. So that is absolutely correct. There's a lot of stringent healthcare guidelines that we are required to follow. That's one of the reasons all our employees are US based. We don't outsource anything, just to make sure we comply with all these stringent regulations. Today we are not required to follow GDPR just because we don't have any European data with us. But I think once we start going global, that's something we will really need to take into account. But one of the things we're actively doing right now is looking at DoD security requirements, because we have something.
So what is DOT? Is it
Department of Defense?
Okay.
So they have very stringent requirements on data protection and what to do with them, and so we are actually evaluating that right now in the company. But the data we get from the insurance company. So whatever data we have, the insurance company already has and sends it to us. So there's nothing new that we would tell an insurance company. In that scenario, if one insurance company, so we've been approached for acquisition multiple times in the past, and I've told everyone that we're too early in this journey to consider that as a possibility. If we do get acquired by one insurance company, then of course there'll be some protection and around data from other insurance companies that will need to be isolated from their access.
How can people find you if they want to learn more about CODOXO, learn more about you, or partner with you in any way, shape, or form?
Sure. I mean, I would love to help people. I think, inshallah, we need more Muslim entrepreneurs. We need, inshallah, lots of successful Muslims who are proud Muslims, but also are entrepreneurs. And I'd love to support everybody on this journey. I'm somewhat challenged on time, but whatever I can do, I'd love to support them. So to learn about the company, CODOXO.com is the website to learn more. I am not on any social media except LinkedIn, so feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Again, my spelling is Musheer, and last name is Ahmed Ahmed. So feel free to reach out on LinkedIn at any time.
All right. Well, perfect. Thank you so much for spending some time with me and answering the questions. And then hopefully we'll have you on for another pod.
Sure. No, thank you, Daniel. I really appreciate the opportunity and look forward to having more conversations with
Absolutely.
you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Well, I guess that concludes our podcast, and I hope that all of you enjoyed it. I hope you all found some value in it. Again, please like, comment, subscribe, give us additional questions. If you want us to interview someone, please put it down in the comments below or email us by going to the About tab, finding our email address, and we'll hopefully interview the person that you think we should interview. If you're an entrepreneur or if you want to just be on the podcast, please, there will be a link in the description below. Go ahead and sign up, and then hopefully you'll be selected pretty soon. So that way I can interview you then. And inshallah, I wish you all the best with your families and your endeavors. Assalamu alaikum.